The first time the outsider arrived, no one knew how to describe her. People later used big words, but in the beginning, all they felt was confusion. She did not look like she belonged. Not in the way she spoke, not in the way she stood, and not in the way she refused to lower her eyes when others expected her to. She came into a place that was already tired. The people there were worn down by years of broken promises, slow losses, and quiet fear. They were not cruel, but they were careful. Anyone new was seen as a risk. She stepped into a system that was already falling apart. Trust was thin. Everyone was protecting what little they had left. Rules were followed not because people believed in them, but because breaking them felt dangerous. In that space, she stood out too much. Some called her strange. Others called her stubborn. A few called her dangerous, though they could not explain why. At first, she tried to work within the lines. She listened more than she spoke. She watched how people treated each other, how power moved quietly from one hand to another. She learned where silence was expected and where voices were allowed. But even when she stayed quiet, her presence made people uncomfortable. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. She noticed problems people had learned to ignore. The pressure started early. Small things at first. Meetings where she was not invited. Decisions made without her input, even when they affected her directly. Smiles that felt tight and empty. Advice that sounded helpful, but carried a warning underneath. She felt it all, but she did not leave. She believed that if she stayed steady, things would change. The crowd watched her closely. Some were curious. Some were annoyed. Most were afraid to be associated with her. They had seen what happened to those who stood out too much. They had families to feed, bills to pay, and fragile peace to protect. So they stayed quiet. They stayed in the background. They told themselves it was not their fight. As time passed, the resistance became clearer. Mistakes she did not make were placed on her shoulders. Successes she helped build were credited to others. When problems came up, her name was mentioned with a pause, as if everyone was waiting for permission to blame her. The system needed a target, and she was different enough to become one. She pushed back, but not with anger. She spoke calmly. She brought facts. She reminded people of shared goals. But calm strength can scare those who rely on control. The more steady she became, the harder the pressure grew. Rules were suddenly enforced only against her. Standards changed without warning. The ground beneath her feet kept shifting. Still, she did not give up. She believed that what she was fighting for mattered more than how she was treated. She believed that fairness was not something you asked for, but something you practiced until others could no longer deny it. That belief kept her going, even as the room grew colder. The war was not loud. There were no shouting matches or dramatic scenes. It was a quiet war. One fought through silence, delays, and slow isolation. Invitations stopped coming. Messages went unanswered. Support disappeared. The crowd noticed, but they looked away. Everyone told themselves the same thing. It is temporary. It will pass. Someone else will step in, but no one did. She began to feel the weight of standing alone. Not just the pressure from those against her, but the silence from those who could have helped. That silence hurt more than open attacks. It made her question herself late at night. It made her wonder if staying was a mistake. Still, each morning, she returned. The system started to crack under its own weight. Problems that had been hidden for years began to surface. Work slowed. Morale dropped. People whispered about failure, but no one wanted to take responsibility. Instead, fingers pointed toward the outsider. It was easier that way. Easier to blame than to change. Meetings grew tense. Her ideas were dismissed without discussion. When she spoke, eyes drifted to the table or the wall. When she stayed silent, people said she was not contributing. There was no winning. The rules kept changing, always just out of reach. The crowd felt the tension growing. They felt it in their stomachs and shoulders. They knew something was wrong, but fear kept them still. They had learned long ago that standing up came with a cost. And they were not sure this fight was worth paying for. She could feel the war slipping away from her. not because she lacked strength, but because she lacked allies. No leader can stand forever without support, no matter how strong their vision is. Slowly, her confidence began to wear thin. She still showed up, still spoke clearly, still did her work. But the spark that once filled the room began to fade. There was a day when everything seemed to turn against her at once. A decision was made quickly and quietly, one that would undo months of effort. She was informed after the fact. When she asked why, the answers were vague. When she pushed for clarity, she was told she was being difficult. That day, the room felt heavier than usual. The air was thick with unspoken things. She stood there, listening, nodding, absorbing the final blow. She realized then that the war was close to being lost. Not because she was wrong, but because she was alone. The crowd was there, as always. Sitting, standing, watching. They saw the way her shoulders stiffened. They saw the pause before she spoke. They felt the shift, even if they could not name it. Something important was breaking. Most of them stayed still. They told themselves they were powerless. That one voice would not matter. That it was too late anyway. Fear is very good at sounding reasonable. She left the room quietly. No dramatic exit, no angry words. Just a calm walk, step by step, down a long hallway that suddenly felt endless. Behind her, the system continued as if nothing had happened. Papers were shuffled. Screens glowed. Conversations moved on. Outside that room, life continued. People laughed. Phones buzzed. The world did not stop for quiet losses, but something had shifted. A line had been crossed. The war was no longer distant or slow. It was now right at the edge. That night, she sat alone with her thoughts. She replayed every decision, every moment she might have acted differently. She wondered how much longer she could keep fighting. She wondered if leaving would mean failure or survival. The weight of the question pressed down on her chest. She did not know it yet, but she was not as alone as she believed. Somewhere in the crowd, someone had been watching closely from the very beginning. Not someone powerful. Not someone important. Just someone quiet, unnoticed, and deeply affected by what they had seen. That person had felt the tension too. Had noticed the unfair shifts. Had recognized the slow, quiet way the system was pushing her out. While others looked away, this person kept watching, learning, feeling something heavy grow inside them. As the war edged closer to its breaking point, the stage was being set. The outsiders stood on the edge of defeat. The crowd remained silent, and one ordinary person was reaching the moment where silence no longer felt safe. The loss had not happened yet, but it was close enough to feel. And when something is close enough, it changes people in ways they do not expect. Among the crowd, there was someone who had always been quiet, blending into the background. No one noticed him much, and he never tried to stand out. He moved through life carefully, avoiding attention, keeping his head down. Some called him timid, some called him ordinary. He had a small apartment, a modest job, and a routine that barely changed. But he saw things others ignored. He noticed the small injustices, the subtle manipulations, the quiet suffering. He noticed her. From the first day the outsider arrived, he watched. He did not cheer. He did not jeer. He simply watched. He noticed how unfairly she was treated, how quietly people cut her out, how slowly the system was closing in on her. He watched the little attacks, the overlooked achievements, the tiny victories stolen from her. At first, he told himself it was none of his business. People have to fight their own battles, he thought. He has always thought that. That is how he survived. But as the weeks passed, something began to change inside him. It started with a small spark of frustration, a quiet anger he could not shake. Watching someone strong and good being pushed down by people who only wanted to protect their own comfort felt wrong. It felt heavy. And he realized that he could no longer ignore it. He began to pay closer attention. He listened more carefully to conversations. He noticed the looks, the whispered comments, the half-hidden instructions. He began to understand the unspoken rules of the place, the invisible lines that everyone else followed, but she could not. And he felt something that had never grown in him before, the desire to act. He thought about it for nights, turning it over in his mind. Could one person really make a difference? Would it matter if he stepped forward? Fear told him to stay silent, to watch and hope. It had always kept him safe, but now fear also made him restless. It made him feel small in a world that needed courage. One evening, he found himself standing on a balcony after work, looking at the lights of the city. He thought about the outsider and the war she was losing. He remembered seeing her face calm in moments when he would have panicked. He remembered seeing her try to reach people who would not respond. And he realized that she was not weak. She was only alone. And he knew that the difference between alone and supported could be him. The next day, he stayed later at work than usual, hoping to see her. When she appeared, moving through the hallway with that calm, steady determination, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. He realized how vulnerable she was. No one was helping her. No one had even offered. Everyone watched, but no one acted. And he felt a strange mix of fear and clarity. He could not sit quietly any longer. The first step was small. A nod when she passed by. A brief smile when she looked up. He did not speak. He could not yet. He was testing the waters, feeling the weight of his own courage. And then slowly, he began to notice that his small gestures mattered. She looked up more often. She did not seem as alone when he was near. Even small recognition had power. He started to observe more openly. He wrote down details, patterns, things that others missed. Notes about unfair meetings, misdirected blame, unacknowledged work. He realized that knowing the truth was not enough. Understanding alone would not change the outcome. Action was necessary. And for the first time in his life, he began to prepare for it. But preparation brought fear. What if he failed? What if he made things worse for her? What if the crowd turned against him too? He thought about these questions constantly. Night after night, he wrestled with them. His routine, which had always felt safe, now felt like a cage. He could no longer ignore the war unfolding right in front of him one day. He saw her struggling with a task that had been assigned unfairly. Others had been given easier work, more time, better tools. She was calm, but he could see the strain. He wanted to speak, to offer help, but he hesitated. He reminded himself that no one had asked him to do anything. But the sight of her quietly fighting a losing battle stirred something deep inside him. He could no longer hold back. He stepped closer. Not boldly, not heroically, but steadily. He asked a simple question, offered a small piece of assistance. She looked at him, surprised, but did not hesitate to accept. It was a small act, but it changed something. For the first time in a long while, she was not completely alone. And for the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility and the strange, thrilling sense of possibility. From that day, he began to act more. He did not announce himself. He did not demand attention. He simply started doing what he could, quietly, where no one else would. He intercepted unfair instructions, corrected overlooked mistakes, and offered help when it mattered most. The outsider noticed him cautiously at first, then with a growing sense of trust. She did not know who he was, but she felt the difference. She felt less alone. The crowd began to notice too. Not everyone, not yet, but whispers started. Someone mentioned that she seemed stronger. Another said she had help. People felt the shift, though they did not understand it. And the quiet observer realized something important. Sometimes one person is enough to start a change. One person noticing, one person acting, can tip the balance. He began to see patterns in others' behavior, noticing fear and self-interest. And he learned to navigate them. He realized that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. And every time he stepped forward, small as it was, his confidence grew. He began to understand that the war was not lost yet, because the smallest interventions could change outcomes in ways no one expected. He still felt fear. He still hesitated. But he had found a rhythm, a quiet power. The outsider was fighting the war she could not win alone, and he was becoming her ally in ways others could not. The moment was not dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no heroic gestures, but the effect was real, tangible. Slowly, steadily, he was making a difference. He began to imagine what would happen if more people acted. If the crowd, so long silent, began to rise, but he knew it had to start somewhere, and it had to start with him. The thought both terrified and excited him. He realized that this was the turning point of his life. He had watched, he had learned, and now he had the choice to act. And though the war was still raging, though the outsider was still under immense pressure, and though the crowd remained mostly silent, he knew that a change had begun. Something fragile, something small, but undeniable. He had risen from the quiet background, and in doing so, he had tipped the first domino. The rest would follow if courage could continue. The day arrived when the pressure in the room became unbearable. The outsider faced a challenge unlike any she had experienced before. A decision was being forced on her, one that threatened to undo everything she had worked for. Everyone could feel the tension, though most pretended not to. Conversations slowed, glances were sharper, and the quiet observer knew that the moment of choice had come. This was the moment that would decide if she would be defeated or if she could survive. The outsider sat at her desk, reviewing documents that seemed impossible to manage in the time given. Her calm demeanor was under strain. Lines appeared at the corners of her eyes. Her hands moved carefully over the papers, but her mind was racing. She understood the weight of the situation. The system that had already tried to push her out was tightening its grip. She could feel the isolation pressing in, almost physically. It was a test, and she knew it. The quiet observer watched from across the room. He had learned the patterns, the small signals that told him when things were about to change. He noticed the subtle looks from colleagues, the avoidance, the silence that had grown thick. He knew that she was close to a breaking point, though she would never show it openly. Something inside him stirred. He realized that if she fell now, it might be impossible to recover. And the thought of losing her to the system sparked a sense of responsibility he had never felt before. He took a step closer, then paused. His heartbeat was fast. He had never taken such a step in his life. Usually he watched, stayed quiet, and hoped, but now hope was not enough. The weight of inaction had become heavier than fear. He realized that action, no matter how small, was necessary. The war she was losing was not just hers. It had become his, in a way he had never expected. He spoke, his voice low but firm. Not a speech, not a dramatic declaration, just a simple question. Do you want help? The room froze for a moment. All eyes turned to them. The outsider looked up, her expression unreadable. She had not expected anyone from the crowd to act. Most people stayed silent. Most people watched. This was different. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his presence without a word. That small nod carried weight. It was an invitation, a permission, a shift in the balance. From that point, the quiet observer stepped fully into the space. He did not take over. He did not try to lead. He simply acted where he could. He organized the papers, clarified the instructions, and subtly corrected errors that had been overlooked. Each small action relieved some of the pressure she was under. It was not enough to win the war yet, but it was enough to prevent immediate defeat. And in doing so, he gave her something she had not had in a long time, the sense that she was not entirely alone. The others in the room noticed. Some were surprised, some suspicious. A few began to watch more closely, curious about what was happening. The quiet observer could feel their eyes, but he ignored them. He focused on the task, on supporting her in practical ways, on keeping the fragile momentum alive. Every small action mattered, and he approached them with care, as if each gesture could tip the scales. Hours passed, and the pressure did not ease. The outsider faced questions that were meant to trap her, challenges designed to highlight her isolation. The quiet observer anticipated some of them, intercepting where he could, clarifying details that others ignored, giving her space to respond effectively. He was still careful, still measured, but his presence changed the dynamic. The system could not fully isolate her anymore. He was a shield, quiet but firm. It was enough to alter the immediate tension. As the day went on, the outsider began to speak more freely, Her answers were precise, measured, but there was a new confidence in them. She had been alone for so long, and even a single ally made a difference. She began to trust that the quiet observer would act where she could not. She did not need to rely on him completely, but the simple fact of shared effort lightened the burden. Her mind was clearer, her decisions more certain. The quiet observer noticed a subtle shift in the room. The crowd, though mostly still, had changed its energy. Some people whispered to each other. Some exchanged looks. The outsider was no longer entirely on the defensive. The war she had been losing felt less inevitable. It was still dangerous, still uncertain, but now it had room for hope. And hope, even in small amounts, is powerful. He realized that the critical moment was not a single action, but a combination of small, steady decisions. Each step he took, each support he offered, each subtle correction mattered. The outsider responded in kind, adjusting her approach, speaking with precision, showing calm strength. Together, they began to turn the tide of that day, slowly and carefully, in ways that were invisible to most but tangible to both of them. By the end of the day, the immediate crisis had passed. Not all problems were solved, but the outsider had survived without losing ground. The quiet observer felt exhaustion, but also a strange sense of satisfaction. He had acted when others would not. He had stepped forward when it mattered most. And in doing so, he had discovered a new part of himself, one capable of courage and initiative. The outsider looked at him briefly, a small acknowledgement in her eyes. It was not praise, not gratitude, not anything dramatic. It was recognition. And for him, it was enough. He understood that the war was far from over, but the moment of choice had been taken. They had faced the critical turning point together. The balance had shifted slightly in their favor. That night, as he walked home, he reflected on the day. Fear was still present, but it was no longer paralyzing. He realized that courage is not sudden heroism, but a series of deliberate choices. Each small act builds the foundation for larger change. The outsider had not been saved, but she had been strengthened by his presence. And he had been transformed by the act of stepping forward. He knew that more challenges awaited, that the crowd remained mostly silent, and that the system would continue to test them. But for the first time, he believed that the outcome was not predetermined. That belief, fragile as it was, carried immense weight. He had discovered the power of one, the impact of a single person acting with conscience and care. In the quiet of his apartment, he thought about what would come next. The war was still ongoing, but the moment of choice had passed. The first step had been taken, and the smallest actions had already made a difference. He understood now that the battle was not only about strategy or skill. It was about courage, about standing up when others remained silent. And that understanding would guide him in the days ahead. The days that followed the critical turning point were tense, but filled with subtle hope. The outsider no longer faced the immediate crisis alone. The quiet observer had stepped forward, and his presence began to change the atmosphere in ways that were almost invisible, yet unmistakable. The crowd still watched from the sidelines, some curious, some wary, but no longer completely indifferent. Small cracks were forming in the wall of silence and hesitation that had kept the outsider isolated. The quiet observer continued to act. Each intervention was deliberate and thoughtful, designed to support without overshadowing. He organized information, clarified misunderstandings, and quietly ensured that the outsider's contributions were recognized. He did not demand attention or create drama. Instead, he focused on practical ways to influence the outcome. And each time he acted, he felt a growing sense of purpose and responsibility. He was no longer just a witness. He was a participant. The outsider noticed the change immediately. She could feel that someone had stepped forward on her side. It was not a dramatic rescue, but it was steady, persistent, and reliable. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of isolation begin to lift. Her confidence returned slowly, not because the problems were gone, but because she was no longer fighting alone. The presence of a single ally shifted her energy. She could breathe a little easier, think a little clearer, and respond with more strength. As the observer continued, he noticed that his actions inspired subtle reactions in others. One or two colleagues, previously hesitant, began to assist quietly. They did not speak openly, but they started to follow small suggestions, to correct minor mistakes or to notice overlooked details. The outsider's momentum began to grow. She could see the first signs of change in the room. People who had been silent were now participating in small ways. Fear was still strong, but it was less absolute. The war was no longer entirely one-sided. The quiet observer realized that courage spreads in ways that are rarely loud or obvious. Each small act of support allowed others to find their own courage. The crowd, once paralyzed by fear and hesitation, began to sense that change was possible. It started with subtle shifts, a nod in a meeting, a clarification of a misunderstood point, a quiet acknowledgement of effort. The outsider could feel the shift, and it gave her energy to keep going. Then came a day when the outsider faced a particularly difficult challenge. The system tried to corner her, to make her appear incompetent. A meeting was called to evaluate her work, but the way it was structured was designed to isolate her and create failure. The quiet observer anticipated the tactics. He prepared notes, organized facts, and positioned himself quietly to support her. The tension in the room was thick, but his presence allowed her to maintain composure. She spoke clearly, calmly, and confidently, answering questions with precision. She no longer felt entirely alone, and it showed. As the meeting progressed, the observer acted in subtle but crucial ways. He corrected misrepresented facts, reminded the group of overlooked details, and offered evidence at the right moments. It was quiet, almost invisible, but effective. The outsider could focus on presenting her ideas without being derailed. She handled the difficult questions and challenges with poise, and the room began to shift. The outcome was no longer a foregone conclusion. The crowd, which had been passive, began to watch differently. Noticing the outsider's strength and the observer's quiet support, by the end of the day, the outsider had survived the confrontation, and more than that, she had gained a small but significant victory. Her work was recognized accurately, and the room had been reminded that she could not be easily dismissed. The observer felt exhaustion, but also a profound sense of accomplishment. He had acted when others would not, and his quiet interventions had made a real difference. The war, once tipping decisively against her, now had room for hope. The days that followed were not free of challenges. There were still obstacles, still unfair treatment, still moments of isolation, but the pattern was changing. Small acts of courage and support were becoming contagious. The outsider was no longer entirely on the defensive. She began to take more initiative, knowing that she had at least one ally who would support her in practical, effective ways. And the observer learned that courage could grow quietly, that influence does not require dramatic gestures, and that even one person can start a movement in the quiet moments. The outsider and the observer began to develop an unspoken understanding. They did not need to speak of strategy or plans. Each knew their role and trusted the other to act where necessary. Their collaboration was subtle, almost invisible to the crowd, but it had a tangible impact. The outsider felt stronger, more resilient, and the observer discovered a depth of courage he had never imagined he possessed. The crowd began to take notice. Not everyone, but enough to feel the shift. Whispers of admiration began to circulate. Some people who had been silent began to participate in small ways. They were careful, tentative, but the movement had begun. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been weakened by the quiet courage of two people acting with conscience and care. The outsider, no longer completely isolated, began to tackle problems that had previously felt impossible. She initiated discussions, proposed solutions, and addressed issues that had been ignored for too long. Her energy, combined with the observer's support, started to influence the system in ways that were subtle but undeniable. The war, once seeming inevitable in its defeat, was becoming a contest again. The possibility of victory felt real. By the end of the week, the pattern was clear. Courage spreads when someone acts. Fear retreats when one person steps forward. Small, consistent actions have the power to influence outcomes that once seemed beyond reach. The observer realized that his quiet interventions had done more than support one person. They had changed the dynamics of an entire system. The outsider, once on the verge of defeat, was now a participant in shaping her own survival in their quiet moments. Both the outsider and the observer reflected on what had happened. They knew the war was not over. Challenges would come again, and the crowd remained mostly silent. But they had discovered a profound truth. Support, even when quiet, can tip the balance. Courage, even when understated, can inspire change. And the act of stepping forward, even in small ways, has the power to alter the course of events. The quiet observer understood that he had changed too. He had faced fear, taken action, and discovered strength he did not know he had. He had learned that being human means taking responsibility, even when the odds seem against you. And the outsider, strengthened by his support, learned that even the most isolated person can survive when someone notices, cares, and acts. The war was still ongoing. The system would continue to test them. The crowd would continue to watch. But the first cracks had appeared. The balance had shifted. And both the outsider and the observer understood that the future, as uncertain as it was, could be shaped by courage, persistence, and quiet action. They had begun to fight, not loudly, not dramatically, but effectively, together. And in that quiet collaboration lay the promise of real change. The days after the small victories were quiet but charged with anticipation. The outsider and the quiet observer had formed an unspoken partnership. And though they did not announce it, their collaboration was changing the environment around them. The system that had once threatened to crush her now faced resistance in subtle, growing ways. The outsider's confidence returned, not because the obstacles were gone, but because she was no longer alone. And the quiet observer had discovered a strength he never knew he had. The crowd, for the first time, began to stir. Some still hesitated, afraid to act. But others, noticing the outsider's resilience and the observer's courage, started to participate in small ways. A supportive comment in a meeting, a clarification of misunderstood instructions, a nod acknowledging effort. All these little actions built momentum. The war that had seemed inevitable in its defeat was slowly changing. Courage was contagious, even when quiet, and people began to realize that standing by and doing nothing was no longer the safest option. The outsider continued to push forward. She tackled problems that had long been ignored. She spoke up when decisions were unfair, proposed solutions for long-standing issues, and began to assert herself in ways she had avoided before. The quiet observer continued to support her in practical ways, offering assistance where needed, correcting errors, and ensuring that her work was recognized. Together, they created a rhythm, a partnership that was subtle yet powerful. It was not a dramatic display of heroism, but its impact was undeniable. The system began to respond. Obstacles still appeared, some designed to isolate or undermine, but they were no longer insurmountable. The outsider faced challenges with a newfound resilience, knowing she had at least one ally who understood the dynamics and could act when she could not. The quiet observer had grown in confidence and capability. He anticipated problems, addressed issues before they escalated, and learned to navigate the delicate balance of influence without drawing unnecessary attention. Their combined efforts shifted the balance in ways that were gradual but meaningful. One day, a significant opportunity arose. A project that had long been stalled due to bureaucratic delays and competing interests finally came into focus. It required careful coordination, clear communication, and determination to move forward. The outsider recognized the stakes and prepared to take it on. The quiet observer, as always, offered support. He ensured that details were accurate, schedules were realistic, and resources were available. He quietly coordinated with others who had begun to act, slowly expanding the circle of engagement. The project moved forward, not without challenges, but with growing momentum. As they worked, the crowd began to participate more openly. Some spoke up in meetings, offering insights or clarifications. Others assisted in practical ways, ensuring that deadlines were met and that obstacles were addressed. The environment was still tense, still filled with remnants of fear and hesitation, but the culture was changing. Courage, once rare and quiet, was beginning to ripple through the group. The outsider's strength, combined with the observer's steady support, had created a new standard for action and responsibility. The impact was tangible. Projects that had seemed impossible began to succeed. Small victories accumulated, building confidence among the outsider, the observer, and the growing circle of supporters. The outsider was no longer fighting a losing battle. She was now part of a network of quiet but determined people, each contributing in ways they could. The observer realized that leadership did not always require recognition or authority. Sometimes the act of acting with integrity and courage, was enough to change the course of events. Over time, the outsider gained respect from former skeptics. People who had once dismissed her began to acknowledge her contributions and competence. The quiet observer noticed these shifts, understanding that change was not only about visible results but also about perception, trust, and consistency. He saw that small, steady actions, combined with moral courage, could transform both individual relationships and the broader environment. The quiet observer also recognized the personal transformation within himself. He had faced fear, acted despite uncertainty, and discovered capabilities he had never imagined. He had learned that the difference between being a passive witness and an active participant could determine outcomes in profound ways. He understood that courage is not always loud or dramatic, but often quiet, persistent, and deliberate. And he realized that standing up, even when it feels risky, has the power to inspire others to do the same. The outsider and the observer began to reflect on the journey they had taken together. They understood that the war was not fully over. There would always be challenges, obstacles, and opposition. The crowd would continue to contain a mix of fear, hesitation, and courage. But they had proven that change was possible. Even a single ally, acting with intention and care, could alter the trajectory of events. And when others joined, even in small ways, the potential for transformation grew exponentially. In the weeks that followed, the culture continued to shift. People became more willing to take responsibility, to act when they saw injustice or inefficiency. The outsider, supported by the observer and a growing network, continued to lead initiatives, address long-standing issues, and modeled the behavior she wanted to see. The observer continued to act quietly but decisively, influencing outcomes through thoughtful, practical interventions. Together, they demonstrated the power of collaboration, courage, and steady action. The crowd, once silent and hesitant, had begun to participate in ways both subtle and meaningful. They realized that change did not require dramatic heroics, but consistent ethical action. They learned that standing up, even quietly, could make a difference. And they saw that supporting others in their efforts was a form of courage just as vital as leading. Ultimately, the outsider survived and adapted to the system, not because she had overpowering strength or authority, but because she had one person who noticed, who acted, and who would not remain silent. The quiet observer had risen from the background to become a crucial agent of change. Together, they had altered the dynamics of the environment, proving that even in situations where defeat seems certain, courage and collaboration can create meaningful change. As the war that once seemed so hopeless came to a quieter resolution, the outsider and the observer understood that their work was ongoing, but that progress was real. They had discovered the profound impact of human connection, moral courage, and the willingness to act. Even when fear and hesitation are strong, their story became a quiet lesson for the crowd. Change begins with one person noticing, one person acting, and one person refusing to stay silent. And sometimes, that is all it takes to turn the tide.